December 19th, 1985. Hillsboro, Ohio. A small-town bar called the North High. Lounge, the kind of place where the neon buzzes louder than the jukebox, and the parking lot holds more pickup trucks than the local dealership. Inside, a 47-year-old man with a voice that once sold 1 million copies of A Song About Quitting is buying drinks for strangers. He is 5 years past his last charting single, 10 years past the moment that made him a household name, and approximately 45 minutes away from pulling a .22 CL beer pistol and shooting a man in the head over an offer of turtle soup. He doesn't know yet that the bullet will graze the man's skull. Close enough to kill, not quite close enough to finish it, and that this near miss will cost him 9.5 years of his life on paper, and 22 months of it behind actual walls. He doesn't know that 2 of the biggest names in country music, George Jones and Merle Haggard, will put up money to keep him out of prison on appeal, and that a governor will eventually sign the paper that sets him free. And he certainly doesn't know that when he finally dies, broke, in a Nashville nursing home at 64, the man who pays for his coffin and his burial plot will be the same George Jones he once stood behind as a harmony singer, back when his real name was still Donald Lytle, and nobody had yet thought to call him Paycheck. Welcome to Country Mysteries. The thing about Donald Eugene Lytle is that trouble wasn't something that found him. He went looking for it with both hands, and he started early. Born May 31st, 1938, in Greenfield, Ohio, a town of about 5,000 people in the southern part of the state, the kind of place where the biggest employer is usually a factory, and the second biggest is the bar across the street from the factory. His father worked construction. His mother gave him a guitar when he was 6, which, in retrospect, was either the best or worst decision anyone in that family ever made, depending on how you feel about what happened over the next 58 years. By 9, young Donald was entering local talent contests. By 15, he had left home entirely, dropped out, hit the road, rode freight trains across the country playing honky-tonks and beer joints under the name The Ohio Kid. At 15. And honestly, that detail alone tells you everything about the kind of household he was leaving and the kind of life he was running toward. Neither one had much use for caution. He lied about his age to join the United States Navy in the mid-1950s, which sounds like the setup for a story about discipline and structure, finally straightening out a wayward kid. It was not that story. In 1956, Lytle was court-martialed for assaulting a superior officer. The specific details of the altercation vary depending on who's telling it, but the result was uniform: 2 years in the brig, a military prison. At roughly 18 years old, "I wasn't built for taking orders," he said in a later interview. Statement so obvious it barely qualifies as self-reflection. Not much of a revelation, all things considered. The man would spend the rest of his life proving it in increasingly expensive ways. What the Navy did give him, besides a criminal record before he was old enough to legally drink, was time to play music. Fellow inmates heard him sing. Guards heard him sing. By the time he was discharged, dishonorably, naturally his voice was the one thing nobody disputed. The question was never whether Donald Lytle could sing. The question was whether anyone could keep him alive long enough for it to matter. And that question, as it turned out, would take another 4 decades to find. Answer, and the answer, when it came, was barely. After the Navy spit him out, Lytle did what any sensible, dishonorably discharged teenager with a guitar and no plan would do. He headed to Nashville. He arrived in the late 1950s, a compact, sharp-featured kid from Ohio, with a voice that could peel paint and a personality that could clear a paint room. Nashville in those years was a machine, a well-oiled suit and tie operation run by producers, publishers, and label executives who viewed country music as a product to be assembled, polished, and shipped. The artists were interchangeable parts. The machine was not interested in rebels. The machine was especially not interested in rebels with military prison records. So Lytle did what a lot of talented people with bad reputations do. Nashville. He became invisible. He started recording under the name Donnie Young, a safer, cleaner alias that sounded like someone who might show up on time and not throw a chair through a studio window. He cut singles for Decca and Mercury, none of which made any commercial impression whatsoever. The voice was there. The songs were adequate. The timing was wrong, and the name meant nothing. But sideman work, that was a different door, and it swung open wide. Between 1962 and 1966, Lytle became a core member of George Jones's backing band, the Jones Boys. He played bass, sang high harmonies, and stood 3 feet behind one of the greatest voices in the history of recorded music, night after night, in the kind of honky-tonks where the floor is sticky and the ceiling fan doesn't work and nobody cares because George Jones is singing. He could do anything on a stage, Jones said of Lytle years later. Sing harmony, play bass, write a song on the bus, start a fight in the parking lot, all before midnight. It was meant as a compliment. It was also, in retrospect, a fairly accurate summary of the next 30 years. The George Jones orbit was not a gentle place to learn the trade. Jones himself was deep into his own legendary spiral of alcohol, missed shows, and marital chaos, the era that would eventually earn him the nickname No-Show Jones. Lytle absorbed every lesson, including the ones nobody was trying to teach. How to drink until standing was optional. How to make a crowd forgive you for showing up wrecked. How to weaponize charm. He also worked sessions and road dates with Ray Price and Farron Young. And if you were keeping a list of mid-century country mentors, likely to model responsible behavior, that list would be very short, and none of it. Those names would be on it. By 1964, Lytle had done something that sounds small, but wasn't. He legally changed his name. Not back to Donald Lytle, forward to Johnny Paycheck. The name came from a Chicago boxer he admired, though the appeal was obvious. It sounded like a threat and a punchline at the same time. Time. Which, to be fair, is also how most people would eventually describe the man who wore it. The reinvention was more than cosmetic. Paycheck wanted to be a star, not a sideman, and the new name was a declaration of intent. A deliberate break from the anonymity of Donnie Young and the baggage of Donald Lytle. The question was whether Nashville would let him have the spotlight. The answer eventually was yes, but not before it tried to break him. First, the first real break came through a man named Aubrey Mayhew, a Nashville producer and label owner who saw in Paycheck something the majors had missed, or more accurately, something the majors had seen and decided was too expensive to insure. In the mid-1960s, Mayhew launched Little Darlin' Records, and Paycheck became its flagship act. Little Darlin' was an independent label operating out of Nashville in an era when independent meant you pressed your own vinyl and hoped someone at a radio station owed you a favor. The records Paycheck cut there, raw, hard-edged honky-tonk with steel guitarist Lloyd Green provided the weeping counterpoint, were some of the best work he ever did. Songs like The Lovin' Machine and Don't Start Countin' on Me cracked the lower reaches of the country charts and earned him a following among listeners who liked their music the way they liked their whiskey, unfiltered and likely to cause problems. But Little Darlin' was a small boat, and Paycheck was an expensive passenger. By the late 1960s, the label had folded, the partnership with Mayhew had soured, as partnerships involving Paycheck tended to do, and the man who had renamed himself after a boxer found himself on the ropes, broke, drinking heavily, using cocaine, drifting west to California, where he lived, by several accounts, on the streets. And I want to pause here because this is important for understanding what comes next. This was not some gentle fade. This was a full implosion. A man with genuine vocal talent, legitimate Nashville credentials, and a name that people in the industry recognized, living homeless in Los Angeles. The distance between backing vocalist for George Jones and sleeping in doorways turned out to be shorter than anyone would have guessed. Then, in 1971, a CBS executive named Nick Hunter tracked Paycheck down. The details of exactly how have been told differently by different people. But the essential fact is that someone at Columbia Records went looking for a man who had more or less vanished and found him. Hunter brought Paycheck to the attention of Billy Sherrill, the legendary producer at Epic Records, who had already built the careers of Tammy Wynette and Charlie Rich. Sherrill was known for his lush, country-politan production style, big strings, smooth arrangements, the exact opposite of everything Paycheck had done at Little Darlin'. Sherrill agreed to sign him on one condition: get sober. Or at least get sober enough to show up for sessions. Paycheck apparently met the minimum threshold because in 1971 he released She's All I Got, produced by Sherrill, and it went to number 2 on the Billboard country chart. Number 2. After years of homelessness, cocaine, and failed labels, it was the kind of comeback that Nashville loves to tell stories about, right up until the sequel. Because She's All I Got opened a door, and what walked through it was a string of charting singles throughout the early to mid-1970s. Someone to Give My Love To, Mr. Lovemaker, Song and Dance Man. Paycheck was suddenly a mid-tier country star with a recording contract, a touring schedule, and an audience. He was also, by every available account, still drinking and drugging at a pace that made his earlier crash look like a dress rehearsal. The difference was that now he had money coming in, which meant the crashes, when they came, would be louder. In 1977, a songwriter named David Allan Coe, himself no stranger to prison, violence, or controversy, handed Paycheck a song called Take This Job and Shove It. The lyrics were simple, blunt, and furious. A Working man telling his boss exactly what he could do with his employment. Coe had written it in the voice of blue-collar frustration, the kind of sentiment that half of America felt every Monday morning but never had. The nerve to say out loud. Paycheck didn't just sing it. He became it. The song hit #1 on the Billboard Country Chart in January 1978, his first and, as it would turn out, his only #1 single. But calling it a hit undersells what actually happened. Take This Job and Shove It crossed over into pop culture in a way that almost no country song had before. It became an anthem. Factory workers played it on their last day. Office employees muttered it under their breath during meetings. It spawned a 1981 movie of the same name. It sold over 2 million copies. And it made Johnny Paycheck a household name, which, for a man with his particular set of instincts, was roughly the equivalent of handing a lit match to someone standing in a room full of gasoline. He was suddenly famous in a way that went far beyond the country audience. He was on television. He was in magazines. He was, briefly, that rarest of things. In country music, a crossover act without actually crossing over. The song did the crossing. He just stood there and collected the checks. David Allan Coe, for his part, had a complicated relationship with the whole thing. The song made Coe's name as a songwriter, but it was Paycheck's face on the album cover, Paycheck's voice on the radio, Paycheck's name in the headlines. Coe later said, with a kind of directness that was either admirable or inflammatory, depending on your point, perspective, that the song was never really about quitting a job, was about a man at the end of his rope. If that was the case, then the casting was perfect. Because Paycheck, at the peak of his fame, was exactly that, a man at the end of his rope who happened to be holding a #1 single in one hand and a bottle in the other. The money from Take This Job and Shove It should have set him up for years. It did not. Paycheck's spending was legendary, not in the tasteful mansion and sports cars way of modern celebrity excess, but in the chaotic where-did-it-all-go way of a man who had grown up with nothing and treated every dollar like it might disappear by morning. Which, to be fair, it usually did. He owed the IRS. He owed managers. He owed ex-wives, plural. His personal life was a revolving door of marriages, separations, and reconciliations that even his closest friends had trouble tracking. And, through all of it, the drinking and the cocaine never stopped. They just got more expensive. The touring circuit kept him afloat through the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, but the chart positions were slipping. After Take This, Job, he charted a few more singles, Friend, Lover, Wife, Me, and the IRS. But nothing came close to the cultural moment of 1977. The outlaw country movement that had made stars of Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson was softening into something more polished, and the industry was moving on. Paycheck was not the kind of man who moved on. He was the kind who dug, and poured another drink and dared the world to blink first. And the world, as it does, eventually obliged. By 1985, the hit parade was over. The money was gone, or owed, or spent, or gambled, or given to lawyers fighting off the IRS and the Various creditors who had learned the hard way that a man named Paycheck was not necessarily a man who paid. He was touring small clubs and county fairs, playing the song that had made him famous to audiences that were getting smaller and drunker and closer to the stage. And then came December and Hillsborough, and a bar called the North High Lounge, and a man named Larry Wise who made the mistake of offering Johnny Paycheck dinner. December 19th, 1985. Paycheck was back in Ohio for the holidays, visiting his mother in Greenfield, just 20 minutes from Hillsborough, a town small enough that a country singer walking into a bar was an event in itself. He walked into the North High Lounge sometime in the evening, and by several accounts, the first hour or so was perfectly pleasant. He bought a round of drinks. He shook hands. He was Johnny Paycheck. Not quite the star he'd been 8 years earlier, but still somebody. And in a small Ohio bar, that was enough. The trouble started with Larry Wise and another patron named Lloyd Bowers. What exactly happened between them has been argued about for 4 decades, and the two versions of events couldn't be more different. According to Wise's testimony at trial, he and Bowers struck up a friendly conversation with Paycheck. The talk turned to food, rural Ohio food specifically, and Wise offered to take Paycheck home for a meal. I told him we had some deer meat and turtle soup, Wise later testified. It was a gesture of hospitality, the kind of thing people in small towns do when they meet someone famous at a bar. Invite them home for dinner. Paycheck, according to Wise, did not take it as hospitality. He took it as an insult. "I'm no country hick," Wise recalled him shouting, and then, before anyone could process the shift in temperature, Paycheck produced a .22 caliber pistol and fired. The bullet grazed Larry Wise's skull an inch to the left, and this would be a murder story. It wasn't, by a margin that owed more to alcohol-impaired aim than to any restraint on Paycheck's part. The defense, naturally, told a different story. Paycheck's lawyers argued self-defense, that Wise and Bowers had been aggressive, that Wise had approached Paycheck with a raised beer bottle, and that Paycheck fired because he believed he was about to be struck. In the anatomy of bar fight defenses, "He came at me with a bottle" is approximately page 1 of the manual, and the jury was not persuaded. What happened next was almost as chaotic as the shooting itself. Paycheck fled the bar. The gun was disposed of. The charge of tampering with evidence would later stick, and he was arrested then. Following morning. The charges? Felonious assault, tampering with evidence, and carrying a concealed weapon. And here is where the story gets its particular country music flavor. Because in any other genre, shooting someone in a bar would be a career extinction event. In outlaw country, circa 1985, it was, and I say this without any admiration, almost on brand. Paycheck had spent 2 decades cultivating an image as the baddest man on Music Row. He had a court-martial on his resume before he could legally vote. His biggest hit was literally a song about telling authority to go to hell. When the news broke that he'd shot a man in an Ohio bar, the reaction in Nashville was less, "How could this happen?" and more, "Honestly, it's a wonder it took this long." The trial, held in May 1986 in the Highland County Court of Common Pleas, found Paycheck guilty of aggravated assault and tampering with evidence, but acquitted him of the concealed weapon charge. The Sentence: up to 9.5 years in prison. For a 48-year-old alcoholic with emphysema and a career in free fall, 9.5 years might as well have been a life sentence. But Paycheck had one thing that most convicted felons do not: famous friends with deep pockets and a willingness to spend them. George Jones and Merle Haggard, both of whom had their own complicated histories with the law, as we covered in episode 13, reportedly helped post bail and fund legal appeals. The appeals dragged on for 3 years, during which Paycheck continued to tour, continued to drink, and continued to behave as though the conviction was someone else's problem. In 1989, the appeals finally ran out. Johnny Paycheck reported to the Chillicothe Correctional Institution in Ohio to begin serving his sentence. He was 51 years old, broke, and still famous enough that the guards knew his songs. Chillicothe Correctional Institution sits in Ross County, Ohio, about 50 miles south of Columbus, a medium security facility surrounded by farmland and the kind of silence that is very different from the silence of a Nashville recording studio. Paycheck arrived there in 1989, and whatever outlaw mythology he had built over 2 decades met the reality of a cell, a number, and a schedule that did not care who you were or what you'd charted. By several accounts, prison was hard on him in the specific way that prison is hard on men who have spent their entire adult lives doing exactly what they wanted. The emphysema that had been building for years, a gift from decades of smoking, made physical labor difficult. His age 51 put him well outside the demographic of most inmates, and the fame, such as it was, attracted exactly the kind of attention that a small, aging country singer did not need in a medium security correctional facility. But he sang. Of course he sang. There are accounts of Paycheck performing for fellow inmates, guitar in hand, doing the hits that had put him in stadiums a decade earlier, now played for an audience that couldn't leave, which, if you think about it, is the darkest possible version of a captive audience. Take This Job and Shove It, performed by a man who had been stripped of every job, every paycheck, and every choice. The irony was not subtle. Nobody pointed it out. Meanwhile, outside the walls, the campaign for his release was gaining traction. Country music has a long, complicated relationship with incarceration, from Johnny Cash playing Folsom Prison to Merle Haggard actually serving time in San Quentin, as we covered 2 episodes ago. And the industry's response to Paycheck's conviction followed a familiar pattern: public sympathy, private fundraising, and quiet pressure on anyone who might have the authority to sign a pardon. The man who eventually signed it was Ohio Governor Richard Celeste. In 1991, as one of his final acts before leaving office, a window that governors historically use to settle debts, make statements, or simply clear their desks, Celeste commuted Paycheck's sentence. After 22 months behind bars, Johnny Paycheck walked out of Chillicothe Correctional Institution a free man. He was 53 years old. He had no money. He had no recording contract. He had a criminal record that now included both a military court-martial and a felony conviction in civilian court. His lungs were failing. His marriages were behind him. The song that had defined his career was 13 years old and belonged commercially to a version of himself that no longer existed. What he did have was a name. And in Nashville, a name, even a damaged One, especially a damaged one, is a kind of currency. The question was whether anyone would accept it at face value. The answer, improbably, was yes. Within months of his release, Paycheck was back on stages. Small ones at first, the county fair and honky-tonk circuit that sustains country careers long after the charts have moved on. He played the hits. He told the stories. And the audiences came because there is something in the country music fanbase that has always valued survival over propriety, the idea that a man who has been through hell and come out the other side, however scarred, has earned the right to stand on a stage and sing about it. The fact that Paycheck had put himself through most of that hell was, apparently, beside the point. In 1997, something happened that nobody, least of all Paycheck himself, would have predicted. The Grand Ole Opry, the most prestigious institution in country music, invited him to become a member. Not as a guest, not as a nostalgia act, as a full, inducted member of the Opry, standing on the same stage where Hank Williams and Patsy Cline and every name that matters in this music had stood before him. The invitation came from Opry general manager Bob Whitaker, who reportedly made the offer personally, a departure from the usual protocol, and a gesture that acknowledged both Paycheck's talent and the absurd improbability of his survival. A court-martialed, convicted, pardoned, bankrupt, homeless at one point country singer being welcomed into the Opry. Nashville loves a redemption arc, and this one had more plot twists than most screenwriters would dare to pitch. Paycheck accepted. He performed on the Opry stage with the same voice that had once filled stadiums, though now it was thinner, rougher, filtered through lungs that had been surrendering for years. The emphysema was winning. It had been winning for a while, but he kept showing up, which, given his track record of not showing up for various other obligations over the previous 3 decades, was itself a kind of miracle. By the early 2000s, Paycheck's health had deteriorated to the point where performing was no longer possible. The emphysema, combined with asthma and recurring lung infections, had reduced the man who once screamed, "Take this, Job, and shove it," to a whisper. He was living in a Nashville nursing home, a detail so perfectly, cruelly ironic that it almost reads as fiction. The man who sang the ultimate anthem of independence, dependent on institutional care in a city that had made his career and then watched it implode. He had very few assets. The money from the hits was long gone, spent, owed, garnished, or simply evaporated in the way that money does when its owner combines a talent for earning with a genius for losing. The RS battles were behind him, but only because there was nothing left to fight over. On February 19, 2003, Johnny Paycheck, born Donald Eugene Lytle in Greenfield, Ohio, 64 years earlier, died at Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville. The cause was complications from emphysema and a lung infection. He had been, in his final months, largely alone, but not entirely. George Jones, the man who had given a teenage Donald Lytle his first real job in Nashville, the man who had helped fund his legal appeals after the shooting, the man who had known him longer and, more consistently than perhaps anyone else in the industry, stepped forward one last time. Jones paid for Paycheck's funeral. Jones provided a burial plot at Woodlawn Memorial Park in Nashville, in a section of the cemetery that Jones had purchased for his own family. The funeral was held on February 25, 2003, at the Woodlawn Funeral Home. Jones was there. Other friends from the old days came. The industry that had profited from him, discarded him, welcomed him back, and then watched him fade, that industry sent its representatives, said the right things, and went home. Johnny Paycheck is buried in Nashville, in ground paid for by a friend, under a name he chose for himself at 26 because the one he was born with didn't feel like enough. He left behind a body of work that is better than most people remember, a criminal record that is worse than most people realize, and one song that will outlive every fact. In this episode, and that song, for anyone keeping score, was written by somebody else. So look, Johnny Paycheck shot a man in the head because the guy offered him turtle soup, got pardoned by a governor, got inducted into the Grand Ole Opry, and then died broke in a nursing home while the song that made him famous, a song he didn't write, kept playing on every classic country station in America. If you wrote that as fiction, no editor on Earth would let you keep it. Too much. Too absurd. Too on the nose. But that's the thing about country music, isn't it? The real stories are always worse than the songs. Let me know in the comments what you think about Paycheck's story was the Opry-induction redemption, or was it Nashville doing what Nashville always does, which is forgiving the talent and forgetting the victim? I'm genuinely curious. Hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe if you haven't already. Next time on Country Mysteries, a stolen corpse, a borrowed hearse, and a fire in the desert. We're talking about Graham Parsons, and that story is exactly as insane as it sounds. I'm Roman. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.